All right, so what we're going to look at today are World War II heads of state and key military leaders. We're going to break this up into two, deal with Allied or Axis and Allied leaders, and then in the second part of the lesson we'll deal with the key military leaders. So what are we looking at here? Anybody know what meeting this is? Pretty famous meeting. Can't remember the name of it? I'll give you a hint. Stalin is hosting.
Is it the, it's from Hawaii?
It does.
Yalta?
Yalta, very good. There's the big three, Yalta, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. This is not long before Roosevelt passes away. What's up?
Yalta, that's on the Crimean Peninsula.
Yeah.
I think I read somewhere, I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure if they solved that one of the reasons they chose that was because Stalin was afraid of airplanes and wanted somewhere we could drive a train.
That's interesting. It's also a resort palace, so it would have been a win-win for him because they would have had this opulent palace to host at, and then that would have been a way for him to get there by rail.
Yeah, and it's quite ironic because it's on Crimea, which is what Black control in 2014.
Right.
But of course, back then it was the USSR, so you could name it, but they were all over the same. So it didn't really matter.
Yeah, that was a point of contention with the Winter Games at Sochi as well. All right, so let's look at Axis heads of state. So we've seen this image before, the Pact of Steel, Mussolini and Hitler. So we'll start with Hitler. Tough childhood in Austria, failed artist, blamed the system, anti-Semitic, bit of a drifter and a vagabond, ended up in Munich, sort of had a wild life in the city as a young man, enlists as an army corporal in World War I, 16th Bavarian Regiment, fought in 47 battles, earned the Iron Cross. Remember, he served as a trench runner. Spoke in the Munich beer halls. This is where the German Workers' Party met. I don't know if you realize this, he actually started as a spy. He was spying on the German Workers' Party, and then it evolved into him joining. Dietrich Eckart, have you ever heard of him? He was like a really famous poet and author, also a bit of a booze hound. He hung around in these areas, and he sort of backs Hitler as what will become the leader of the German Workers' Party. Becomes head of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Imprisoned after the Munich beer hall protest that led to the gun battle in the streets of Munich. This is where he writes Mein Kampf. It'll be written in 23, published in 25. And then he starts the idea of the construction of the labor camps and concentration camps to isolate the Jews early on, sort of laid out in the theory of Mein Kampf. Technically, yes, you were right, but that system had been used in colonies by a lot of world powers prior, and even Spain used it in Cuba. Not good at all. Became Chancellor in 33 of the Third Reich, becomes Der Führer in 34 after the death of Paul von Hindenburg, starts the war with the Polish invasion in 39, leads Nazi Germany all the way through World War II, 19 different assassination attempts, will ultimately commit suicide. I know we have some conspiracy theorists in the room. After the fall of Berlin and the bunker. We'll deal with that a bit later. Here we have Hitler as a child. He's sitting there as a soldier in World War I on the far left, and the picture on the right, far left. Bottom left, this is a picture as a member of the rising Nazi party, and then on the right there, Hitler, and below him is one of his top leaders, Heinrich Himmler. Speaking of Himmler, just missed World War I due to his age, became a leading part of the German Workers' Party. Can we keep it down? Thanks. Head of the German Waffen-SS early on, launched the Night of Long Knives, also launched the invasion of Poland. Chief of the German police, later the Minister of the Interior, oversaw the Gestapo, the secret police of Nazi Germany. We're going to talk more about the Gestapo when we get into the early parts of, well, we've already talked about the early parts of the war in Europe, but we start talking about Germany and the Holocaust, etc. Overseer of the concentration camps, extermination camps. He is in charge of all aspects of SS, including the SS death squads, carried out attacks as a part of Operation Barbarossa. Primary architect of the Nazi extermination policy after the Nuremberg laws were passed, and really the second most powerful figure in the Nazi regime. Committed suicide in May of 1945 after the Soviet and Allied invasion of Germany and the fall of Berlin. Von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister under Hitler, negotiated all of the Axis alliances, the Pact of Steel, the Non-Comintern Pact, negotiated the Non-Aggression Pact with Molotov, lost a lot of influence throughout the war, was one of the big leaders tried at Nuremberg, was sentenced to death, and was hanged in 1946. We'll talk more about the Nuremberg trials and their symbolism later on. Joseph Goebbels, he is the German Minister of Propaganda, played a hand in Kristallnacht, attacks on German Jews, one of Hitler's most trusted politicians, worked alongside the Nazis' head economist, Walter Funk, and then he is one of the last few in Hitler's bunker. He and his wife commit suicide, and also he kills his wife, 6 children, and commits suicide in Hitler's bunker in 1945. Pretty much everybody for the most part, everybody in the bunker followed through with suicide. In fact, there's a book that inspired a film called The Downfall, and it's basically like a sort of a look at the last days of those who were in Hitler's bunker. It's pretty, it's tough to watch. I've never read the book. I've seen the film. German subtitles. Yeah, very. Albert Speer, main architect of the military buildup of Nazi Germany, architect by trade, engineered the Nazi war mobilization, Minister of Armaments and Munitions, increased the German war production until September of 1944, and would serve 20 years for war crimes. Let's move on to Italy. Mussolini. He's going to be highly educated. Was a teacher at 18, served in World War I, became a newspaper publisher, began the fascist movement, jailed for a short time for his views raised by the Labor Party leaders, organized the paramilitary group known as the Black Shirts, became Prime Minister of Italy. The fascist plan to return Italy to greatness was orchestrated by him. ordered the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, and entered Italy into World War II in 1940. A lot of focus on North Africa, ultimately sucking a lot of the Nazi military strength to North Africa, which we're going to talk about in Lesson 9, the North African Campaign. He's executed after the Italian surrender and the fall of Rome. He and his mistress's bodies will be hanged upside down in Rome. I did not include that image here, but I will include that image when we talk about the fall of Rome later in the semester. Here's Il Duce Mussolini. Hirohito, 124th Emperor of Japan, presided over Japanese policy throughout the war, but was largely a figurehead. He's the guy that allows Tojo to rise to power as minister of the military and then prime minister. In the final days of the war, he intervened to press the military to terminate hostility. And I added this, Michelle figured out the man lived till 1989. Tojo, longtime military officer in the Japanese army, aggressive military action upon launching the invasion of both Manchuria and China in the 1930s. Main military commander for Hirohito, rises to the rank of Prime Minister of Japan in October of 41, continued the Japanese militaristic tradition. After a short attempt to improve relations with the U.S. over the embargo on oil and steel, ordered Operation Z, the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, took on more roles in the Japanese ministry, and by February of 1944 claimed himself commander-in-chief. Resigned after the Japanese defeat, attempted suicide, but was later executed for war crimes. Here's Tojo on the left. This is an image of Tojo sort of being nursed back to health after his suicide attempt, only to be tried, convicted, and executed. Admiral Yamamoto, leading naval strategist, early advocate of the carrier-based aircraft and naval operations. He and Tojo could work for both heads of state and for military leaders. Served as Minister of the Navy and commander of the Japanese First Fleet, helped plan both Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway. Didn't believe that Japan could endure a long, drawn-out war with the United States. Was shot down by the United States inspecting the Western Solomon Islands in 1943. I put him in the category of heads of state because he was much more than a fleet admiral. Pétain, the head of the Vichy French hero of World War I, advocated for the armistice of German invasion of France in 1940, offered the Germans armistice on June 22, 1940, with the French surrender, served as head of the French Vichy regime that collaborated with the Nazis, tried after the war and sentenced to death, and leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle, commuted the sentence to life in prison. So let's take a look at the Allied leaders. Anybody remember what conference is happening here? Who do we recognize in here? Churchill and FDR. Good. Bonus question, who's on the back right there? On the far right. No. Good guess. Not a West Pointer, but a VMI graduate. Nope. George C. Marshall, very good. So what's happening here? There's a clue. Almost looks like Churchill's wearing what type of uniform? It is a military uniform. But it's what style? Take a look. Take a guess. It's a conference we've talked about, and it leads to a charter that we've talked about. I'll give you one more clue. This is after the sinking of American ships. Yeah. Excellent. Nice job, Thomas. It is the Atlantic Conference, leading to the Atlantic Charter. So let's take a look at our Allied commanders. Stalin is kind of tough. We almost need to put him sort of lying somewhere in the middle there. Stalin obviously rises to lead the Soviet Union after the death of Lenin. Murdered and imprisoned almost all of Russia's senior military officers and millions of others during the Great Purge. Remember, he pushed Trotsky to end up in exile, and Trotsky goes to Mexico. What happens to Trotsky? He's killed, right? He's assassinated. Further damaged Russia's military ability to fight after the German invasion of Russia in 1941, ignoring NKVD, Soviet intelligence, and British intelligence, believing that Hitler would not break the non-aggression pact, made General Georgy Zhukov the savior of Moscow and the savior of Stalingrad, his top military advisor. Also sent him to command the forces directly in key battles. In the end, allowed the huge Russian military to use its full potential, but it led to the death of millions in battle. After the war ended, Stalin's political terror continued, and so begins the Cold War. And this obviously continues until his death in 1953. We'll talk more about the origins of the Cold War as we discuss the fall of Berlin and the end of World War II. And another major conference that is held in Germany, known as Potsdam. Here we have a young Stalin on the left, and then Stalin as he looked in World War II on the right. Let's take a look at Molotov. Molotov is the Soviet foreign minister throughout the war. Obviously started with the Nazi-Soviet pact, or the non-aggression pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. Continued as Stalin's foreign representative with the Allies after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and also personally met with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Chiang Kai-shek, head of the state of nationalist China, launched the Second United Front against Japan, working in collaboration with the communists who were led by Mao Zedong. After the Japanese surrendered in 1945, Chiang fought a bloody civil war against the communists who were led by Mao. He was officially backed by the United States and was president of the Republic of China until his death in 1975. FDR, New Yorker, Harvard graduate, 32nd president of the United States, had a military background in the Navy. Stricken with polio, though, in his 30s on vacation. Initially followed a really strong political demand to remain neutral and isolationist through the Depression, but realized Nazi aggression would ultimately lead to a potential global war. Declared that the United States would become the arsenal of democracy, carried that out in his famous fireside chats those that started all the way back during the New Deal in his first term in office. He brokers the destroyer deal, Lend-Lease, Selective Service, the Atlantic Conference that led to the Atlantic Charter, declared war on Japan after the attack on December 7th, 1941, threw American industry into full war production, elected to an unprecedented 4 terms in office, and died in April of 1945, shortly before the end of the war, which will lead to his successor, President Harry S. Truman, becoming president. Here we have FDR on the top left, and then this is the war declaration on the bottom right. Truman went to law school but dropped out in Kansas City. Senator from Missouri at the outbreak of the war, elected vice president in 1944, in FDR's last and final campaign, becomes president on April 12, 1945, after the death of FDR, continues to carry out FDR's military policies, also keeps on a number of FDR's key military advisors, notably George C. Marshall. Found himself on a collision course with Stalin at Potsdam, had a good working relationship with Churchill, sort of became a mediator between Churchill and Stalin, ultimately makes a decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan through the Manhattan Project. They were developed through the Manhattan Project, and then held office until 1953. He actually won a upset re-election against George Dewey, and he played a leading role in shaping really the contours of the early Cold War. He's important for a number of different Cold War policies in the post-war era. Marshall becomes the Secretary of State. He'll usher in the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after the war. He also has to make the decision to lead a UN action in the Korean War. The policy of containment also starts with Truman. Containment of communism. And then early intervention in Vietnam occurs under Truman as well. Cordell Hull, Cumberland School of Law grad at Samford in 1890, father of the UN, Secretary of State through nearly all of Roosevelt's 4 terms, longest serving Secretary of State, 11 years, criticized for wanting to support the Vichy French and for turning away thousands of Jewish refugees, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945 for his role in establishing the United Nations. Tennessee native, Cordell Hull. Henry Morgenthau, New York native, graduate of Cornell, U.S. Treasury Secretary during the war, played a major role in designing and financing the New Deal and also the ramp up for funding the billions of tax dollar revenue that will lead to the military buildup during World War II. Played a major role in foreign policy, established policies to support China in helping Jewish refugees. Morgenthau himself was the first Jewish cabinet member in United States history, and he was the only Jewish cabinet member on FDR's staff. And he established the Morgenthau Plan to prevent Germany from ever again being a military power, but this did not come to fruition. Henry Stimson, Yale class of 1888, Harvard Law, 1890, served as U.S. Secretary of War from 40 to 45, oversaw the military buildup during the during the First World War and during the Second World War. Instrumental in the peacetime draft and the selective service. Instrumental in the planning process with Marshall to get soldiers trained for combat. Personally oversaw the Manhattan Project. Neville Chamberlain, last pre-war Prime Minister of Great Britain, associated with the policy of appeasement and the Munich Conference with Hitler, would declare war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, but would later be replaced by Winston Churchill in May of 1940. Churchill, as we talked about before, born to nobility, first Duke of Marlborough, graduate of RMA Sandhurst. Do you know what RMA means? Royal Military Academy. So he had military training. Fought in the Suez, was a journalist during the Second Boer Wars, served in the Naval Department in World War I, resigned after Gallipoli, and then would go on to fight in World War I. Served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is Department of the Treasury in Parliament, Minister of Munitions, Secretary of State of War, Secretary of State of the Royal Air Force, highly acclaimed author on both the studies of naval and artillery tactics, served as colonial minister for a time, belonged to the Conservatives in the House of Lords early on, railed against Hitler's violation of the Versailles Treaty, pushed for Great Britain to militarize and prepare for a looming war, became Prime Minister on May 10th, 1940, replacing Neville Chamberlain, encouraged Great Britain to keep up their morale during and after the Battle of Britain, led the country through and after the war and the start of the Cold War until 1965. So here we have Churchill in the center there in his wartime service on the top left. That's more of the iconic picture of Churchill in the top right. And then in the center, I just wanted to add that one again. That's my personal favorite picture of Churchill during the Battle of Britain. King George VI, King of England, reigning monarch of the British Commonwealth during the war, acted as commander-in-chief of a number of states, UK, Canada, Australia, a symbol of national and Commonwealth unity during the war. He and his family visited bomb sites, munitions factories, met with Commonwealth soldiers. Members of the royal family served, including Princess Elizabeth II, now the Queen of England, served in the forces known as the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She served as a truck driver. So here we have the King of England on the top left, and then here he is with Elizabeth, and then there she is on the bottom in front of one of the wartime trucks that she drove for the Red Cross. Charles de Gaulle, this is where we're going to wrap up. Leader of the Free French forces, went into exile with the Free French in England, tank commander in the French army, key cabinet member in the French government until 1940. As I mentioned, went into exile in England, leading the training and command of the Free French soldiers that remained. Distrusted by many of the Allies, he and FDR did not have a good relationship. Later founded the Fifth French Republic. So this is a good spot for us to stop.